Welcome back to another episode of the Empower Grief Journey podcast. I'm your host, Chris Mamoni, and I'm an acceptance coach who helps people heal from grief, loss, and trauma to discover their self acceptance and step into their personal power. This podcast is your dedicated space for healing, growth, and transformation. Each episode shares insightful and inspirational stories, along with practical tools and actionable insights that can help guide you along your healing journey. Today, I have an awesome guest with us. Her name is Hannah Darby, and she's a holistic healer and certified grief educator from the UK, and she helps people navigate their journey through grief. Her anthology book, When Hearts Heal, recently launched this past month, and she has recently become a certified grief expert through David Kessler's coaching program. Her experiences with grief run deep through losing her father at the age of 13, and most recently when she broke her back in 2016. She shares a powerful story about navigating grief and finding meaning and purpose through her journey to help inspire others as they go forward in their own grief journey. And so, without further ado, I want to welcome Hannah. Hannah, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Chris, and all your listeners. Thank you so much for having me here today.
Likewise, and I just want to say a big congratulations to you about your book and getting your certification through grief. I think those are amazing accomplishments in this space.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been such a whirlwind this past month. It kind of hardly feels real because we've just made the Amazon Global Bestsellers list, which is absolutely incredible. And we raised over £4,000 for a UK charity called Little Lives with the profits from the book. So that's definitely going to improve a lot of children's lives. They offer counselling and technology to disadvantaged children.
That's incredible. Great work on that. That's exciting.
Yeah, really exciting. And I'm really pleased with the certification to be able to work with somebody as renowned in the grief space as David Kessler and to be able to learn from him. It's been a truly humbling experience.
Well, I know you mentioned on your grief journey with me in the pre-interview that this all kind of happened when you were 13 years old and lost your dad. And you shared with me a little bit that, what went on during that time when you lost him about not having a lot of support in the grief community and not having a lot of support on just how to navigate grief going through that loss really puts you on a different path in life.
Yeah, it really does. And, that's another reason why I'm so happy about the money we've raised with the book being able to offer counselling services to children going through things such as grief in school. Because when I was 13, we weren't offered any kind of counselling or support or any kind of services from the school or the doctors or anything at all. So, we were just left to kind of navigate it on our own. So I'm really pleased that those kind of services are now available for children.
Well, I think that's a big part of grief that people don't understand is that it is going to change you on a very deep and profound level of things in your life. And you are going to question parts of yourself, question relationships you have, question working at a job you may have that you just don't like anymore. There's going to be a lot of parts of you that change on a very deep level as you navigate through grief. And you may come out a very different person than who you were before experiencing that loss in your life.
Yes, I mean, it made me question my faith. I mean, that was a really kind of hard point for me, trying to navigate that. But then also, my faith was a rock that helped me through my grief as well. And that's what led me onto the path of being a holistic healer today. When I was 13, I was struggling so much with all these kind of different emotions and feelings, and I didn't know what words to put to them. So I went on to study psychology at university, just in out of anything, just to find out more about myself and why I was feeling the way I was, and being able to put names like, PTSD and anxiety and depression, and finally realized that no, actually, that what everything I was feeling was normal and valid, and just a normal response to grief.
And I wanted to have you share a little bit more about that period of life because I know that that was a very pivotal moment for you. What did that season of grief feel like for you? Because I know a lot of people have a hard time putting grief in words in many ways, and part of my listeners love hearing the story about when you went through that loss. What was that like for you initially in that period of grief, and maybe what were some turning points for you that put you on the course you're on today?
I mean, it was a really hard time. I'm not going to deny that, but I was very lucky that I did have a very supportive group of friends around me that I generally owe my life to, and I'm so thankful for them every day. But it was hard, it was numb, and you just wanted to feel something. But then when you felt something, all you could feel was this pain and this anger, and trying to navigate that anger, being angry at my dad for leaving and angry at God and the universe for taking him away, but also then feeling guilty for being angry. Because how can you be angry for somebody who's dead? Being able to kind of juggle all of those emotions at a time that's generally pretty tough, without having any other kind of massive life experiences put on top of it was hard. And music was a massive thing for me as well. Music really helped me get through my love of rock and metal, and being able to find kind of solace in their lyrics, and know that there were people out there who'd been through things and made it out the other side and created these fantastic lives, just gave me a real sense of hope.
Well, since you brought that up, I wanted to ask you because I was going through your media sheet you sent me, and you came up with a beautiful acronym for HEAL. I'd love for you to share with the audience.
Yeah, of course. So, like, this is my acronym that I've developed throughout my healing work, not just with myself, but with my clients as well, which is HEAL. So, H stands for healing the relational wounds. And grief is all about relationships, so that's a massive thing, because it's the relationship that we had with what we lost, whether that's another person, a pet, or parts of ourselves, or even a job or a career, or a home. You have a relationship with all of those items. uh, E stands for expressing pain and anger, because I think anger is something that's very misunderstood, and it's not necessarily always a bad thing, because it can just be a show us kind of how passionate we were about something and how much we cared for it. But also that anger shouldn't be held onto or buried, that we need to be able to express it, and we shouldn't feel bad about expressing our anger. A stands for acceptance, being able to accept your new reality, because grief puts us into a place in a world that we really were not expecting for. But unfortunately, we don't have a choice about that. We've just got to learn to be able to navigate this new world and accept the world that we've been thrown into. And you do a lot of that being an acceptance coach. And then L is learning to live and love again, because grief is a sign of love. It's about how much we loved and cared for whatever it was that we lost, and that we shouldn't feel guilty for being able to find joy and happiness and learning to live and love again, because whoever it was or whatever it was that we lost wouldn't want us to be living the rest of our life in sadness. We need to honor their memory and be able to live the life that they've not got the chance to live.
I think that's such a beautiful acronym when I read that because grief is that journey of relationships changing. Anger, I love to talk about that a little bit because anger is a big part of grief. And I think that a lot of people misunderstand what anger actually is. And I personally tell people that anger is a secondary emotion, it's not a primary emotion. And it's usually something that's masking a deeper emotion that's a lot more heartfelt and meaningful underneath it. What's your take on anger and grief and the role that it plays in your grieving process?
I mean, yeah, I completely agree with you. I think anger is more of a surface emotion, and what's buried under that is love and passion and pain and sorrow, and all of those things kind of fuel into the anger. But anger is a natural part of the grieving process, and if we don't allow ourselves to go through that, then we're not going to be able to move on to the next stage of our grieving. And that anger is just a feeling, and feelings are just feelings. Feelings are neither good or bad. They are just a feeling. We've kind of in society put anger into kind of a negative box in a way, when really it's neither negative or positive. It's just a feeling.
Well, I think that's something that society has in turn made anger this big, ugly thing. And if anybody shows a sign of anger, we automatically blame them or make assumptions about them that there's something wrong with them or that they need to get that under control. And I think when you go through grief, and I've lost a child, so I can say anger was a big part of that process in a lot of ways. But I learned that anger really is a lot of love with nowhere to go. It's really a lot, like you said, passion behind it. It's a lot of just raw emotions going on. And I think that anger, if used in the right way, can really guide you towards better understanding yourself on a much deeper level of going through your grief process, because it is going to show you those parts of yourself that you may not always allow yourself to see. And you may try to hide or cover up certain ways when you're around people that don't hold space for you in the grief process.
Yeah, completely. And I think, we're almost taught to just bury our anger. And as soon as anybody kind of shows a little bit of anger, there's almost like a fear from society about that. But, we need to be able to express it. And the longer we hold on to it, the more it's just going to tear us up on the inside, which is what happened to me as a teenager, and sent me down a bit of a self-destructive spiral that was going to end badly unless I kind of realized that I needed to pull myself out of it and that expressing that anger was okay. And for me, music, that was a place where I expressed my anger when I was out and, at a music gig, that was a place where I could, safely express it through the music and do the dance and everything. And that was really kind of healing to be able to have that outlet for myself.
What was it like for you to when you did process your anger? I know you said music was a big part of that, and I love the outlet of rock music, by the way, because here in the States we have a lot of rock artists that talk about anger in various aspects, and there is a lot of relief through music when you listen to those lyrics, you listen to the beat of things, it kind of moves that energy through you. What was your experience when you did work through anger? What were some things that got shown to you as you navigated that?
I think really just how much it was masking the sadness and the pain inside, and that actually working through that anger then helped me release the tears and helped me actually dip into all of those other emotions once I kind of pushed past that and been able to accept the fact that, yeah, it was okay to feel angry and that, there's no negativity in being able to feel that anger. I was kind of surprised at how much love and passion and was buried underneath it. And writing was another big thing for me as well, which really, really, really helped.
I'm glad you brought that up because I have been talking to people lately about how powerful journaling is. And I got asked one time, how exactly does writing help you? And I said, well, for me, it's taking everything out of my mind and putting it down on paper so I can visualize it, because sometimes there's an emotion trapped up here. And when you start writing, it kind of starts coming out, sometimes in code format, sometimes in straight, but it gives you this ability to process those emotions a little differently. How was writing for you a good process through grief, and how did writing help you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of journaling, always have been. And I look back, and it's nice to keep those journals as well and look back at them and realize, how far you've come and been able to process these things. It was really, really powerful for me. Like you said, being able to give my thoughts form and get them out of my head and onto the paper helped to just clear my mind to be able to process them a bit better and help me uncover like exactly where those feelings were coming from and explore them in a safe way that I knew nobody else was going to read them or I wouldn't be judged in any way. It was just me and the pen and the paper, and I could just be raw and authentic and just let it all out. And that kind of release was so important. And I also wrote my dad a letter when I was 13, and I took it to his grave and I wrote down everything that I wanted to say to him that I didn't get the chance to say. So I took that to him and I sat there and I read it to him, and then I set it on fire and I burnt it. And that has to be one of the most healing things that I did for myself in that period of time, because it was just me and him and God, and there was no judgment there. And I just, poured my heart and soul into it, and being able to get all of those feelings and those words off my chest just was a massive sense of relief and like a giant weight being taken off my shoulders.
I love that you brought that up. I wrote my son a letter before he was cremated, and I'd really think when you do lose a loved one like that, I could tell you were close to your father. This is the way you talk about him. I think it's a beautiful way to express your feelings towards somebody, and I do know that writing a letter and reading that to that person in that moment, even if they've passed at that point, but reading that letter to them and burning that is a very healing pass, because I do think that it puts the words and the energy out there into the universe in a way that will connect with them spiritually. I do think that's just a powerful modality in that moment for you to express yourself where you're at. I wanted to ask you a question about faith because that's something that I've talked to a lot of people in the grief space. There's people I've talked to that don't have faith. I've talked to people that are very spiritual. I've also talked to people that are very religious. How has faith played a role in your grief process and over the course of your time in the grief industry?
Faith for me was always a bit of a funny one because I'd always been a Christian, but not a conventional Christian. I don't really go to church, but I'm a massive believer in God. But then I also really love horror movies and heavy metal. So like I'm really just like a whole mix of things that really shouldn't go together. But faith has always been with me. And there was a time when I kind of lost my faith straight after my dad died because I was just so angry at God and kind of I had to feel like I had to blame somebody and put that anger onto somebody. And he was the only thing that I could kind of think of to be able to put that anger onto. That did leave me in quite a dark place. And then I started kind of exploring scriptures and speaking to people a little bit more about it. And then realizing that actually, that was nothing to do with me. It was, that was my dad's journey and it was just his time to go. It was no reflection on me or my life or anything I'd done. And it's just unfortunate that that's the way it was supposed to be. And then I slowly kind of rebuilt that relationship with God and made my faith into my version of my faith instead of trying to have a faith that fitted into a box, and trying to be labeled, I'm a very spiritual person. But I'm very much more spiritually Christian than religiously Christian. But my faith has been a rock, and then if I just go forward a few years when I had my car accident, like when as soon as I started to feel the car start to wobble and I knew there was nothing I could do, I just relaxed and I said a prayer. And in that moment of time, it was one of the most clearest kind of peaceful moments in my lifetime. It's like the whole world just stopped and my whole mind emptied, and I just put all of my faith and everything into him. And I was just like, whatever's going to be, is going to be. There's nothing I can do. Just please make sure I'm okay. And here I am. So.
That's a very noble approach to going through a car accident like that. And I know you mentioned breaking your back. Did that, and you didn't tell me that in the pre-interview, but did you break your back through that car accident that you were in?
Yeah, I did. I was driving home from work one day and I wasn't even going very fast. It was about 30 miles an hour. It was an adverse camber. There was mud on the road. I turned the corner and I just felt the wheels start to go. And then I could feel it. I knew that there was nothing I could do to change it and that the car was going to spin. So I just kind of relaxed and let go of the pedals and everything and put all my faith into God. And then I span round and flipped the car and ended up facing the wrong way on the opposite side of the carriageway. But I'm just so pleased that there was no other cars around at that time and that there was nobody else in the car with me because the passenger side ended up a lot worse off than the driver's side. So.
And I'm really glad you survived that. And that was something I wanted to bring up and ask you on the podcast today is about breaking your back. What was that experience like and how did that test you? I'm sure it tested your faith in a lot of ways because I know when a back injury is very, very serious because you can end up paralyzed in a lot of ways with certain injuries to that extent. But also, how did that change your perspective on grief? Because this had happened a few years after losing your father.
It really just gave me a new lease for life, and that anything can happen at any given moment in time, and we've got no idea what's coming around the corner. So we've really just got to grab life with both hands and take full advantage of every experience that comes our way and enjoy it and learn to find all of those the good lessons and the smile buried in every sad moment, because within each kind of negative experience, if you look really hard enough, you can find some kind of positive with it buried within it somewhere. So I go back to kind of the death of my father. I'm really pleased that I experienced grief at such a young age because I've seen much older people get broken and grief completely tear their life apart. And me being able to navigate that at a time when you are more kind of emotionally resilient and you can bounce back so much quicker, it's really given me a life with a set of eyes that most people don't get until they're a lot older.
I think that's just very powerful because I couldn't agree with you more that when you do go through such a heavy loss like losing your father, I lost my grandfather in 2020 and watched him pass away. And when you go through those big experiences of grief the first time, it's a lot. It's a very heavy feeling of a lot of emotions, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of I don't know what this looks like now. I don't even know what this looks like in the future. It almost, you said it really well a few minutes ago about almost like your mind goes numb, like your mind just closes off, and it's just, there's like almost nothing but emptiness up there. You don't really know what you think or feel or understand in that moment, but you're just somehow witnessing something, not able to make sense of it. And I think that to your point, people that do experience loss very early on in life, like you did, it almost sets you up in a way where you are going to face hard times again. You are going to face grief again, and you are going to face those challenges. But it almost prepares you in a way to handle those things just a little bit better.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I think that other losses I've experienced since then, other family members, friends, parts of myself, haven't hit as hard because I've almost been knowing what to expect, and I know how it's going to sit in my body and how it's going to feel. And I know that even though when you're in those lowest of low moments, there is, it sounds cliche, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and you've just got to ride the wave and it will get better. But also that grief comes around and hits you in the face when you least expect it, and that you never truly get over it. And, it can still just be as raw as the day when it happened, 10, 20 years later. Um, it really is just like an ocean and the waves coming and going, but you're never quite sure when that wave is going to hit.
And I think that's a big one. I'm glad you brought that up because I'm trying to change that stigma in society in the country that I'm in because people have that idea that you have to let go of grief. You have to move on. It's part of life. You just have to accept it. And I think that that mindset is very dangerous, I think, because it sets up a false reality for you of writing off your experience and not really giving yourself space to process what happened. And like you said too, I think when you have that ideology of just letting go and moving on, grief is going to come up at some point. It's going to get triggered by something. For me, it's around the holidays. I get triggered seeing little kids constantly being happy. That's a big trigger for me. You might run into somebody that looks like your dad or sounds like him, or somebody says something that your dad said to you is profound, and it's going to trigger grief in a moment that you don't always expect. And so I love that you have that ideology that it is like an ocean. It ebbs and flows as you go on with time. And so it's really about learning how to understand that it's not going to go away and you're never really going to get over it, but learning how it affects your body, you take on grief, and being aware of it when it happens.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the most kind of dangerous sayings out there, that, you can get over it, because nobody ever gets over it. Once it enters your life, that's it, it's with you. And you've got to learn to live with it. When I broke my back, I went through some functional physiotherapy, which was with the psychologist and the physiotherapist. And the way they described pain was that you can't fight against your pain. You have to learn to live with your pain, and like make pain your friend. And I feel like grief is very similar. If you try to fight the grief, it's just not going to work. You're going to end up just get digging yourself a hole into a much worse place. Whereas if you try to like open your heart up and just let grief in and learn what it's trying to tell you, and all of the kind of the little lessons buried beneath it, and learn to see grief as a friend rather than an enemy, it makes the whole journey so much easier.
Yeah, because grief comes up in very unexpected ways, and it's what I try to tell people. And anger is also a way that it kind of notifies you. When you go through a big loss like losing a parent, losing a grandparent, losing a child, things like that, you are always going to get triggered. And I think anger is something that can be kind of a warning sign for you, if you will. It can kind of notify you, like a notification on your smartphone. Anger kind of
Yeah.
just notifies you to say, hey, grief is still here in this capacity. You still have these feelings going on. It's time to pay attention to yourself. It's time to listen to yourself right now, because this is trying to communicate something to you. And I've always taught people that as you go through grief, emotions are messages. They're not things to be controlled or manipulated, but they're things to listen to, messages to hear. I was curious what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really lovely way. I think, your emotions do come up and they are just trying to tell you something. It's saying that you're either pushing too hard or you're not giving yourself enough credit. You're not giving a certain part of yourself all of the honor that it needs. And I think, grief, we can kind of lose ourselves, and then we stop taking care of ourselves. And I think a lot of the time it's a reminding us to just stop and take note and truly be present in the moment and present in our bodies, because that's another thing for me. I think that escapism, when you're in grief because you don't want to feel it, is a big thing. So trying to pull yourself back into the here and now is a really hard thing to do, but it's so important in your healing journey. For me, it's the feeling of being numb is the big warning sign for me, and that numb is actually a feeling. It's just a feeling of not having any feelings. And when I start to feel myself kind of dropping into that place, I've noticed that I've either been pushing myself too hard. For me, it's when I'm really overtired or really overstressed. That's kind of when things start to activate me more. And a bit like you said, certain times of the year, like around the death anniversary or Father's Day, and or other little things. I mean, we live in the British countryside and we spend a lot of time outdoors. And sometimes I'll just be on a walk and something will hit me, and it's just because I've then had a memory come up that I really wasn't expecting, and it's taken me back to that time. But then I've learned to see that that's a really happy moment, and being able to be gifted these little memories. And even though they do make us feel sad, it makes me so happy to be able to have those reminders kind of given to me, and then so that we're not forgetting them, we're honoring them and moving forward.
I think that's really beautiful the way you said that. I wanted to ask you, because you brought up your acronym a little bit ago, I wanted to ask you about acceptance, because that is something that I think a lot of us struggle to put words to context with acceptance and what that really means as you go through the grief process. And I'd love to get your perspective about that. What do you think acceptance means, and what has it meant for you on your grief journey?
I think for me, it's just accepting that you can't go back in time. Things will always be different, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And that acceptance doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean forgiveness either. So you can accept that something's happened without forgiving that situation or a person. And also you can accept that was what happened, but and also not forget. It doesn't mean you're not forgetting them just by um, being able to accept what's happened. I think that fits in a lot with mindfulness. Has been a really big thing for me, just being able to be truly present in the moment and and accept the reality of what we're living at this moment in time. It's been a massive thing. I think acceptance has been the hardest one for me to kind of get my head around as well. It's taken me a long time to be able to kind of accept that life will always be different again, and I was really tested by that a few years ago when I got diagnosed with ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome, and learning to accept that my life was never going to be the same again, and that I just had to be able to kind of navigate this new world. And it was really strange because then I almost felt like that little 13-year-old girl again that had lost her father. And nobody was ever kind of warned me about that. And people don't talk about that kind of profound grief you can have for parts of yourself when you go through a massive accident or get a life-changing diagnosis. And I think, the grief of those kind of health conditions needs to be more talked about.
Yeah, I think that was really beautiful how you said that, because I've told people that acceptance doesn't mean you like it and it doesn't mean you agree to it, but you take that situation for what it is and not what you think it is. And so it's easier said than done, by the way. I want to preface that for listeners.
Yeah.
It's easier said than done. Uh, like Hannah just talked about with her medical diagnosis she got, that is life changing in a lot of ways. And that means that you may or may not be able to do certain things the way you normally would going forward. And it will have future impacts on things that you might not even get to experience at this certain moment in life. But it kind of, when you get to that place of acceptance, you put yourself in the present moment just to be here, not worrying about the future or the past, but just allowing yourself to be present. And I think that's where there's a lot of power to be found, and that's very, very hard in life. I'll share with you since you brought that up, Hannah. I had a hard time with acceptance after I lost my son. It took me a good year to really just accept the rawness and reality of that. That was a very hard one to overcome, and I'm still fight it every day, by the way. But that acceptance piece of just saying that this is my new life going forward, and I don't like it, and I don't have to like it, and giving yourself permission to say those things, but also to say that I've got to create a new future and I've got to create a new path forward, and I'm giving myself permission not to forget, but to build and create.
Yeah, definitely. And I think acceptance is something that's not really spoken about a lot in grief. And I just wanted to touch on there that we build up stories around our grief, but we have to remember that the stories are not the facts, and I think every once in a while it does us a real good job just to strip it back and look at the facts of what happened. And, without the story attached to them, because our mind just loves stories and it loves to create stories, but those stories aren't necessarily exactly what happened, and we just have to remind ourselves that stories and facts are different.
I couldn't agree more with you on that. I know that stories play a big role in our mindset that we have. Stepping into my coaching mindset for a second, the stories that we tell ourselves, by the way, like you said, sometimes they may have a little fact in them, but sometimes, more often than not, they're our perception and our experience of life and how we saw something, how we felt, how we navigated a journey. It may not always be the factual side of things. And I think that's where stories can be our greatest gift, but they can also be to a detriment to ourselves. So we have to be careful what kind of narrative and story we build from our experiences of things. And I think that's where grief has so much power is what I see in it. I don't see it as a negative thing. I see it as a very powerful chapter of our life, a very powerful experience. And so being mindful of the story that you create from it and making sure that story is something that is supporting you, something that can in a way and in some ways build you up or help you move forward in your grief process, I think is a very powerful mindset to have as you create a story, because sometimes stories have the ability to put us in a victim mindset, which can really take away the experience of our loss or even the meaning and purpose behind it. I always tell people that there's gifts, lessons, and blessings, even in the worst moments of grief. They're always there. I don't expect people to see those things right in the moment of it because I sure as heck didn't. And I'll say it's very hard to when you're processing all those heavy emotions, but they're always there. And so sometimes that story may change, by the way. It may be a story of pain up front, but a year or two or 3 or 5 years down the road, however long it takes on your journey, that story might change a little bit, and it's okay for you to allow that story to change and evolve.
Yeah, and we're always looking for reasons, or especially with grief, there's that wanting to blame somebody else, and quite often that can end up being ourselves. And our brains will always kind of have a negative bias, so it will always go towards the negative situation rather than the positive. And it's just being really aware of that, and that these stories that we create around our grief aren't actually anything to do with our grief. And moving past those is really quite a powerful thing. And I think that's where again the journaling and the writing comes in, um, to massively kind of help you, and being able to realize that actually that's, say for example for me, it's like my dad said he felt a little bit funny like an hour or two before he had his heart attack. And then I was like, oh, what, I kind of blamed myself, because I was like, oh, what if I'd made him take an aspirin, and then would he have then lasted long enough for when the ambulance came that they would have been able to revive him. And for years after that, I blamed myself because I didn't make him do that. But that's a story that I had built up around that grief, because there's no guarantee that even if I had done that, he still wouldn't have been made it, or that he would have even taken the aspirin. Or so that's kind of like shows us how these stories that we build up around our grief actually kind of feed into the negative of it and stop us from being able to process it and move forward.
Yeah, and I think that's where, you brought up a powerful part of grief that I don't ever hear talked about a lot, but blaming ourselves, I think, is a big challenge to overcome as we navigate grief. I think that we're so trained in society to look for blame in everything that we see. I've caught on to that pattern a lot as I've gotten older. And when we go through grief, I think it's really important to understand that blaming ourselves is actually, in a lot of ways self-destructive in a lot of patterns. And I think it allows you to miss certain meanings and certain lessons or certain things you should learn or take away from that experience. And I try to tell people that there's always going to be other things in the world outside of you that can blame you for all sorts of things. So I would say give that blame thing to somebody else or some other thing. Give it away from yourself, but move away from blame in the sense of allowing yourself to fully experience what happened through that grief process. Just allow yourself to be there and just say, I experienced this, or I felt this, or I saw this. Because when we walk down that path of blame, I think it puts us in a place of, almost hurting ourselves and holding us back from really taking away the most powerful things of that experience we go through in grief.
Yeah, definitely. It just doesn't serve as any kind of good good effect at all, really. And being able to kind of move past that. But that's a really kind of it's a tough pill to swallow, and it's something that we don't talk about as well. I think the guilt and blame and the anger of grief are things that aren't discussed enough. And that grief is just random. Like death can just be random. There's no rhyme or reason to what happens. It just happened, and there is nobody to blame because it's just an event that happened. And we love to attach meaning or find meaning to everything, but sometimes there just isn't meaning.
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things I heard in my grief journey, and I always preface this with listeners, I don't expect you to understand this one if you were just now going through a heavy grief or loss situation. One of my coaches years ago shared with me when we do go through losing somebody very important to us or another big grief section of things, we have to understand that that was their experience, that was their walk of life, that was their journey, that was all for them. It really was. Our experience was being there to witness that and being there to experience what they were going through. And so what it did in my head, it was really hard for me to hear that when I was in the throes of grief because you've got all that emotion going on, that grief, that anger, that guilt, that blame, by the way, comes up. But what I came to find is that when I'm able to see things from that perspective, just be the observer of that situation for a moment. Don't take on that experience as your own because truthfully it's not. What you are there though is to be able to observe that and be a part of that process for whatever that person's going through with their experience. And so what I try to tell people is that one of the ways you can get the most out of that grief experience is understanding that that other person's loss, whatever way that happens, if that was a heart attack or that was cancer like my grandfather went through, or even when I lost my child for that matter, when I lose him to stillbirth, it wasn't my experience, but I was there to witness it. I was there to observe it. I was there to have that moment in my own capacity. And I think it leads us to what you said a lot about stories, what's fact versus what we experience. And so I try to share with people a powerful way to start kind of working through grief, if you will, is putting ourselves in that place of the observer and stepping away from ourselves for a minute, but just to say, in those terms and words, I see this, I feel this, it looks like, it sounds like, giving ourselves a way to kind of separate from the emotion just a little bit so that we can have a better idea of what story we want to create out of that grief experience.
Yeah, definitely. And another one for me was kind of how would I have spoken to a friend if they were in this situation, and I should be speaking to myself as if was speaking to somebody else. So I wouldn't be saying all of these negative things and having this blame and you know putting all of this pressure on a friend if they came to me and said that. I would have said, oh no, it's not your fault, it just happened. And being able to kind of talk to yourself in that way is really kind of can be really healing and really powerful. And a lot of the times where if we say that to ourselves when we get into those kind of conversations with ourselves, we wouldn't talk to somebody else like that. So why are we talking to ourselves like that? We should be respecting ourselves and giving ourselves the respect and love that we deserve, that we give other people.
That is well said, Hannah. I appreciate you saying that just now, because you're absolutely right. We're always helpful to other people. We always can see how to help them and serve them. But when we always look at ourselves for some reason, more times out of not, we're harder on ourselves than we are to other people. And so, why not give ourselves the grace and respect we deserve when we go through those moments? If we can give that to other people, we have the power to give it back to ourselves. And I think it's a well-deserved trait for us to do in that moment of grief.
Yeah, definitely. And that's kind of saved me out of a lot of sticky situations. And it's a hard thing to do because once your brain kind of goes down that negative bias, it's really hard. But if you can just, as soon as you notice that, just catch yourself and just kind of bring, like you said, bring yourself out of the situation for a moment and just think, what would I do if this was somebody else? And then you realize, oh, actually, well, I wouldn't have said any of those things to them. So why am I making myself feel awful?
So I wanted to ask you about the last letter in your acronym for HEAL, leaving a legacy and learning how to move forward in life and creating a new future. What did that process look like for you after going through grief? I know it's one, by the way, that's always evolving and changing, but you've gone through some really heavy moments of grief in your own life. And what did that look like as you started to heal? And what did that path look like for you when you were trying to create a new future for yourself?
I think it's that remembering that living and learning to love again does not mean you're forgetting that person or that thing. And it doesn't mean that you miss them any less or that they were any less important to you. It just means that, unfortunately, our life carries on and life is what we make of it. And, I kept thinking to myself, well, my dad wouldn't want me to be sat here. Really sad and really upset, and the other one was I had a friend who died to suicide, and his funeral was the same weekend as Download Festival, which is a metal festival in the UK, and he was a big metalhead. And we were really like, there was a big group of us, and we were really kind of torn between, do we, not go to the festival and go to the funeral, or do we go to the festival and not go to the funeral? And at the end of the day, we thought, well, if he was here, he would say to us, don't you dare miss out on, going to that festival. I want you to go there and have a drink for me and have a mosh in my honor, and do it for me because I can't be there. So that was a really hard thing to do, and there was a lot of kind of conflictions about that. But I'm really pleased that we did go and that we did do that, because I really feel that that's what he would have wanted us to have done.
That's a beautiful way to celebrate, and that's what my grandfather told me before he passed. As he said, "You can't put your life on hold for me. I've lived a long life. You haven't lived yet." And he said, "You've got to go do your thing and go find out how to be meaningful in your life." So I love that he said, "Go have one more mosh for me." I love that.
Yeah. I can
um,
just imagine him looking down on us, and just yeah. So, um, and I think that's it. We've got to carry on in their honor and in their name, and live life to the fullest, because they haven't got the opportunity anymore, and you never know when life is going to change. So if you don't say yes to that opportunity this time, so a lot of the time you think, oh well, I might get another opportunity, but in reality you might not. So I always think, and life is all about experiences. We can't take anything else with us when we're gone apart from our memories and what we've done. So I think that's what life is all about, just to experience as many things as we can, and do them for all of those people that can't be with us anymore and can't experience them for themselves.
I think that's really beautifully said, and you couldn't be more right. I talked to a friend of mine that lost her house in a house fire, and I called her saying, I'm sorry you lost everything, and she said, I'm not. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And she said, I can't take this with me when I die. I can't take all this stuff with me. She's like, I have all the memories up here. That's all I need. I can buy a new house. I can do all those things. It's fine. And I said, well, that's really paradoxical to how most people think, but I said, I totally get it. So I love what you said about that, that it's our experiences we can take, and we never know, by the way, like you said, how many of those experiences we're going to have. So living very present and living very fully in the moment is something I've taken away from our talk today that's been very powerful. Um, Hannah, I wanted to ask you as we wrap up the podcast, I want to talk a little bit about the book that you were a part of. It sounds like it's an anthology.
Yes, it's an anthology written by myself and 18 other heart healing practitioners, with a foreword by Dr. Joe Vitale, star of The Secret, and he's authored over 90 different spiritual books, so it was a real honor to have him write the foreword for us. And it dives deep into what heart healing is, the power of the power that lies in our heart. Our minds are wonderful, but I think the heart is where the true healing happens. And each practitioner dives into their own expertise and how heart healing has helped them and their clients on various different topics, from kind of false masculinity to ADHD. And then I wrote my chapter on grief and how heart healing really allowed me to kind of tap into those feelings and let that little girl inside me let go of all of her pain and her anger and her sadness in a safe and supportive way. It really was kind of the missing link in my healing journey. I've done a lot of mindset work, and but there was just something missing. Like I knew that was how I should be feeling now, and how I knew textbook how to change it, and I'd had various different therapists, talking therapists, but nothing really kind of helped tie them all together and connect the dots and really allow me to just express all of those emotions that I thought I already had expressed, but a lot that I was actually still kind of buried so deep inside me that I hadn't realized that they were still there. It was massively healing for me. There's 5 universal wounds of the heart, which are enoughness, love, trust, worth, and acceptance. And it was the acceptance wound that was such a massive thing for me, being able to kind of accept that that's what happened and be able to let go of that and just learn to live and love again.
What were some of your, what are one or two big takeaways you got from writing an anthology book? Because I'm in the process of writing my first anthology with 23 people, and it brings up a lot of emotions. It brings up a lot of feelings that you might not have necessarily felt recently, but you reflect back on these moments of grief. And I was just really curious for you when you were writing through that process, were there any big revelations that came up for you?
I know it wasn't easy, being able to having to go back to some of those places that you don't like to revisit is a hard thing to do. But then also, it was massively healing. And for me to just see how far I've come, and that I'm really not that little 13-year-old girl anymore. And, I've overcome so many other obstacles in my life and done so many incredible things and had so many incredible experiences. Um, and really kind of honoring that journey that I've been on by writing about it. And for me, grief is something that's just not talked about enough, and I really love your podcast, and I'm on such a mission just to make it less of a taboo subject and get everybody talking about grief, because unfortunately grief is universal. It's something that everybody is going to experience in some form or in some way at some point in their life. So the more that we can learn about it, the more we can understand it, the more we can share our experiences and learn from each other, the less scary grief becomes, and we accept it as a normal part of life and part of the circle of life. That is what happens in the world. Things go, things are born and things to die, and it's all about what you do in the middle of it that's the important bit. So I'm really just wanted to share my story with other people in the hope that somebody out there might read it and just feel less alone and be able to get like a little nugget of strength and inspiration. Then I know that it wasn't all in vain.
Oh, I really love that. Well, Hannah, this has been a very powerful episode on the Power of Grief journey, and I'm really grateful that you and I got to talk today and that we got to hear your story about losing your father, breaking your back in the car accident, and who you become as a person because of those experiences in life. I think you're a true testament that grief puts us on a journey that throws us into our alignment of who we're supposed to become and where we're supposed to be. And I can tell you're doing a lot of very beautiful work in the grief space, and I want you to continue that work in the meaningful capacity that you're doing because, like you said, more of us need to talk about grief, more of us need to open up about it because it is a very personal, individual journey, but it's through our individual stories being talked about, our emotions being expressed, that we can truly help and serve others to find their own aligned path. So I just want to say a big thank you to you today for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to all your lovely listeners out there for letting me be in this space with you. And I really just hope that something in this episode touches you and gives you a little bit of strength that you need in this moment in time.
And as I wrap up the podcast, I usually ask my guests a couple questions. One of them is if you were to run into somebody going through grief right now, or maybe somebody who's stuck in grief, what's one thing you would share with them to help them navigate that journey just a little bit easier?
To do grief in your own way. You know, grief is a universal thing that happens, but it's a very personal journey. And your grief, however you're dealing with your grief and however your grief looks for you, you know, that's the right way for your grief to be for you.
I think that's beautifully said. And if people want to connect with you after listening to the podcast episode today, where can they find you?
Yeah, no, lovely. Reach out if you've got any questions at all. You can find me on Facebook at Hannah S. Darby, or I've got a website, which is healingwithhannah.co.uk, or I'm on Instagram at healingwithhannahd.
Well, for listeners today, I want you guys to know I'll have Hannah's links to her social media and her website on the show notes. So when you guys get done listening to the episode, look down there. You guys will be able to connect with her. I definitely recommend you reach out to her. She's got a lot of great content in the grief space. And as we talked about today, she recently launched her anthology book. So you guys go check that out when you visit her website and social media. Hannah, again, just thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.
Well, I want to thank our listeners for joining Hannah and I today on this episode of the Empower Grief Journey podcast. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with somebody you know who could benefit from Hannah's story. For more episodes that are designed to empower you and support you during your grief journey, visit empowergriefjourney.com and subscribe to this podcast. You can find us on Apple and Spotify. The Empower Grief Journey is all about honoring your journey, embracing your emotions, and finding strength in your own time. I want you to know you're never alone on this journey, and together we can navigate grief with courage and compassion. Until next time, be kind to yourself and take your grief journey one step at a time.